A couple of lovers and their dog were standing over a manhole because the girl had dropped her phone there. The guy called his girlfriend to find the phone, and it was under a manhole. When he opened it, he saw that the device was lying in frog eggs. No matter how disgusted I was, I had to get the phone. The guy reached for it and screamed. He pulled out his phone, his face showing surprise and fear. Slimy eggs stuck to his hands and the device. They seemed to be devouring the boy's body. The girl screamed in fright. The caviar began to grow and attach to her hands. Appa called for help, but the girl chased him away and eventually ran away scared. She ran so hard that she tripped over her own foot and fell. When she stood up, she noticed that she had fallen near a river, the banks of which were covered with disgusting eggs. The events moved to the bus, where the young man looked at the time on his phone and waited for arrival in Seoul. It was the first day of the school trip, and his first day in the capital. Despite the boring 2-hour ride, he was in a good mood because So-yeon, a beautiful dark-haired girl, sat where he could see her perfectly. At school, Yeon-woo couldn't talk to her properly, so he didn't want to waste any time on the trip and invited So-young to go shopping and eat. Yeon-woo blushed heavily when he was called from the front. It was Kim Joo-bin, a friend of his who was a fan of Oki, who noticed the unhealthy look on his face and offered him some gum. A girl blogger interrupted their conversation. She pulled out a tripod with a phone and told them to wave if they wanted to be featured on her blog. The third-grade class of Chang'an School waved in unison for the Hong Kong TV blog. It was a small class, taking up only half the bus. Blogger Hanmi filmed their every move wherever they went. Even the class teacher managed to catch a few words for VTube. The teacher said they would stop at a park to rest. Everyone stood next to Hanmi and took pictures for the blog, but Yeon-woo stayed away. His head was filled with dubious thoughts. He imagined that if he had his own blog and made videos like Hanmi, So-young might talk to him. Kim Joo-bin interrupted Yeon-woo's thoughts. They talked about how blogging is child's play. Joo-bin talked about his favorite singer's performance, but Yeon-woo's attention shifted back to So-young. Hanmi started filming her. She asked him about his impressions of Seoul, and the guy looked at her with calf-like eyes in love. During the monologue, So-young noticed that Yeon-woo was looking at her and responded in kind. He was embarrassed and quickly turned away. The girl was approached by other classmates to get into the blog. Yeon-woo hoped that when they made eye contact, the girl was looking back at him. Kang Ji-hoon, the head of the class and a tall, blonde, handsome man, approached the group. He easily joined the conversation. Yeon-woo wanted to be able to talk to them in the same way. Hanmi spotted 2 alienated boys and headed over to them, as the guys hadn't introduced themselves for her blog yet. It was Yeon-woo's turn. He introduced himself and his excitement was palpable. Hanmi called him cute enough, which made him even more embarrassed. During the interview, Yeon-woo was still distracted by So-yeon. She was called to take a picture. He couldn't take his eyes off the girl. They were interrupted by the class teacher, who suggested that they all take a picture together. Suddenly, ugly pigeons flew at them and the class moved away from them. Only Yeon-woo noticed that the birds looked rather strange. Blood and what looked like frog eggs were visible from the hatch grate. The pigeon decided to peck at them when suddenly either the hatch or the eggs sucked him in. He fell through the grate. The elder lured the boy's attention. He wanted to know why Yeon-woo was hanging out alone. Another boy, Kang Ji-hoon's friend, approached them. The headman asked him to do him a favor, and his friend asked if Yeon-woo knew what loyalty was. The matter was not so urgent and could wait until the hotel. Even though the conversation with the boys had interested Yeonva, he was still thinking about what had happened to the hatch and the pigeon. But he was still thinking about what had happened to the trap door and the pigeon. The class arrived at the hotel. Hanmi also filmed this event for the blog. The teacher went to get the keys, leaving the starosta in charge. The blogger wasted no time in filming everyone in the hall. While everyone was cramming into the frame, talking complete nonsense, Hanmi noticed that Yeon-woo was sitting alone, carefully looking at something on his phone. The boy was reading the correspondence in the class's group chat. They were discussing a photo they had sent together. Park Seo-young also commented on it. Jeon-woo noticed that the girl had also changed her profile picture. The guy clicked on the photo and admired it, when Hanmi appeared out of nowhere behind him. Frightened, Yeon-woo was lucky that the sun lit up half of the screen, so his classmate could not quite see whose photo the boy was staring at. However, Hanmi was very inquisitive and asked whose profile Yeon-woo was looking at, because she was not satisfied with the answer, no one's. The girl attacked the guy's phone like crazy, demanding that he lend it to her for a second. Jeon-woo was lucky. Hanmi was taken away to film her classmates preparing for a talent show. As she left, the girl said she would talk to Jeon-woo. The guy could not find a place for himself. Hanmi is a real insider. If she finds out who it was, the whole blog will know about it. Yeon-woo's self-exploration was interrupted by the headman. He had been looking for the boy for a long time and took him to the toilet to talk. When Kang Ji-hoon arrived, he opened his briefcase. It was completely filled with soju. Yeon-woo screamed in surprise. Other classmates appeared from behind the booth and brought drinks as well. A party was planned for tonight. Yeon-woo was required to be the carrier of the bag. Even if he is caught, he will still be a hero on this journey. But the guy just turned around and was about to leave when Ji-hoon offered something that Yeon-woo simply could not refuse. The headman also invited all the girls to the party. And if a guy wanted to get closer to someone, it was a great chance that should not be missed. Mentally, Yeon-woo had already given up. Even if So-yeon was there, he would not participate. The cool Kerwonik returned to the hall. Yeon-woo was sitting with a briefcase full of soju. Nothing bad could happen. The students had to be divided into rooms. Teacher Chung-eung helped them with this. He asked everyone to come to him. Yeon-woo could not find a place for himself. He was worried. Juben came up behind him and scared him. His friend noticed that the guy was nervous. Juben took the cards out of his pocket. They were forbidden and he could be kicked off the trip for that. But Yeon-woo was not an easy man either. He opened his briefcase to show what he was hiding in it. His friend screamed. Yeon-woo tried to shut Juben's mouth, but it was too late. Chung-eung heard them. He asked me to give him the bag to check. There was no turning back. Yeon-woo was finished. The boy was talking to the class teacher. There was a soja next to him. Yeon-woo said that this was all he had brought. The teacher was furious and said she would talk to his parents when she arrived. A broken Yeon-woo returned to the room, imagining how angry his parents would be. There stood the headman and his friend. They immediately attacked the guy, thanking him for saving them. He was a hero to them. Yeon-woo noticed more soju in Ji-hoon's briefcase. The headman said they were going to a party with alcohol. He asked where it would be. Ji-hoon said they hadn't decided yet, because the teacher was on patrol. Promising that he would tell everyone about Yeon-woo's actions, they left. Finally, they told him to get some rest. They will call him when they find a suitable place. It was nighttime. Yeon-woo sat on the edge of the bed. There had been no call from Ji-hoon. What was worse was that the place where everyone was gathering, So-yinka could have been there too. Yeon-woo was furious. He had been sneakily framed and used as bait to sneak in alcohol. The next day, the class arrived at Namsan Tower by cable car. Juben told Yeon-woo about the road, but he did not listen to him. The boy felt empty. He looked at So-yeon and wondered if she had been with them yesterday. Yeon-woo waited for Ji-hoon, but he kept making excuses, and now he ignored the boy. Yeon-woo's anger knew no bounds. Ji-hoon, the shameless bastard, had wanted to use the boy from the very beginning. He didn't understand why he hadn't been called. Did the others not want to see him? Just then, Juben told the girls in front of him that it was the first time Yeon-woo had ever ridden the cable car, that he was scared. The boy's frustration was transferred to Juben, because one of the girls was So-yeon. However, the girl reacted very nicely. She said she had never been on a cable car before and that it was very cool. Her friend asked Yeon-woo what happened yesterday. So-yeon was supportive and asked if it was true that he had been caught with alcohol. The girl was impressed by Yeon-woo's courage. The boy said it was very simple. Yeon-woo was over the moon. It was the first time So-yeon had ever taken an interest in him. Unfortunately, the conversation was interrupted. It was time to go into the cockpit. He felt that they were very similar. It was time to get closer to So-yeon. Yeon-woo had intentions of talking to the girl. We received a long notification on our phones warning that there was an outbreak of some kind of virus in Seoul. Then a bird crashes into the booth. It was a pigeon that looked quite strange and frightening. It made a hole in the glass with its beak. A second later, other pigeons began to crash in, one after another. The booth seemed to be covered in huge layers of white. Danger was approaching. Yeon-woo said it looked like frog eggs he had seen in the manhole. But no one supported him in this hypothesis. One egg leaked through the glass crack and fell to the floor of the booth. Everyone was jostling and panicking. A strong stampede began. Someone stepped on Yeon-woo's foot. He screamed. He turned around and saw that it was So-yeon. Yeon-woo was scared and apologized for his leg. So-yeon was very close. She was holding on to Yeon-woo's back with her hand. She was literally breathing down his neck. Suddenly, I heard the class teacher shouting from behind me. She asked me to calm down and stop fighting, otherwise she would be crushed to death. Kang Ming, a friend of the headman, stepped forward. He came closer to the frog egg to take a closer look. When he looked closely, he noticed that the egg was moving. The booth arrived at its destination. The controllers inspected it in shock. It was not a pretty sight. As soon as the door opened, the children ran out one after the other screaming, despite the warnings of the controllers to go down the stairs carefully. There was chaos in the booth. Everyone was screaming, storming around, and some refused to come out. But Yeon-woo was preoccupied with his own thoughts. He realized that So-yeon was standing behind him. It was time to talk to her, and he didn't know when he would get another chance. Jeonwoo started to apologize for stepping on her foot. So-yeon didn't let him finish, because he had already apologized for it. His mouth seemed to have a life of its own. He was talking nonsense and made a bad joke about a cable car and pigeons. Calling himself an idiot in his head, he gathered himself and mumbled an invitation to So-yeon. The girl did not wait and asked if Yeon-won was trying to tell her something. This question sent him into a panic. Looking into So-yeon's eyes, he gathered his thoughts. The sweet, light expression on her face acted as a calming influence on the boy. He gathered his thoughts and invited So-yeon to go to the observatory with him. But the girl's attention was drawn to someone screaming. It was Gale. She was sitting on the floor. A crowd of people gathered around her, including the class teacher. Her leg was beginning to be covered with frog eggs. They spread like a spider's web on the girl's body. According to the girl, the virus jumped out at her out of nowhere and sprayed her. She screamed and kicked her leg until someone fell down the stairs. It was Min-ji. She was shaking and could not get up on her own. She gathered a crowd of caring people around her who helped her get up. No one expected to see this when Ming-ji stood up. The faces of his classmates showed great surprise and fear. Her pale, once pure face was now covered with white eggs. Her gaze was strange, like a madness. A supervisor ran up to Gale. He wanted to help her because she was still screaming and shaking just like Min-ji. The girl grabbed her rescuer and begged for help. Her eyes were full of madness, and her body was becoming more and more covered with white eggs. Mister's hand immediately began to be covered with the virus. The girl was still begging for help. The controller, noticing this, immediately pulled away from the girl and screamed. Both his hands were covered with eggs. He was as scared as she was. In shock, he started running around like a madman. Other workers ran away from him in terror and screaming. His hand was completely covered with the virus. Others, who had not yet managed to leave the booth, watched with horror in their eyes. The classmates decided to close the cubicle as soon as possible to prevent the virus from reaching them. The headman, who had closed the door, held it with all his might. Hanmi asked what was happening because she could hear Gale's screams. The sight made my blood run cold. Gale was lying in a pile of eggs as if a huge spider wanted to completely wrap her in its web. Hanmi was worried about her friend. She wanted to break out of the booth and help her. Ji-hoon stopped her. The girl was being reckless. He yelled at Hanmi. Didn't she realize that the virus was spreading through her? Gale looked like a monster. Their screams were interrupted by a knock on the glass. It was Gale's hand, or rather the hand of a monster, white as a corpse, covered with white eggs. When everyone returned, they could not believe what they saw. The once sweet girl, Gale, now looked like a zombie. Her skin was unnaturally white, the color of the eggs that covered everything, and her eyes were cloudy and teary. The girl begged for help because it was unbearably painful to endure. The booth was in chaos. Everyone was screaming and shouting. They wanted to escape from this nightmare, but they couldn't. Gale clung to the door and screamed frantically. The voice did not sound like hers. It was the voice of the devil. The events moved to the entrance to the observatory. There, the class teacher and the security guard talked about the booked excursion and the route to it. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a sound like a herd of elephants running by. The teacher turned around in fright. They were students who ran out screaming and screaming. The teacher tried to calm them down and unite them. She was shocked by what was happening, but her attention was interrupted by something else. It was Ming-ji, lying helplessly under the stairs, shaking. The class teacher rushed to the girl's aid because she was responsible for the children. Kneeling down in front of Ming-ji, the teacher wanted to pick up the girl, asking if she could hear her and asking her to stand up. When Ming-ji looked up, the teacher screamed in shock. Her face clearly showed wild fear. The girl could not be recognized. All that could be seen was her mouth, begging for help. She was in great pain. The events moved back to the booth. The frightened students huddled together and sat on the floor. One of them asked to see Min Gale. No one wanted to do it, but still, Kim Jubin turned around and saw a horrible picture. Gale's body seemed to be decomposing and rotting alive. The guy screamed, and chaos and pushing to the other end of the booth began again. After clearing his throat, Jeon-woo realized that he had goosebumps all over his body. The way Gale looked was frightening. The boy's attention shifted to So-yeon. She was standing next to him, trembling. Her expression screamed of childlike fear. When they met his eyes, Jeon-woo decided to ask if the girl was okay, but she didn't have time to answer. They received a warning about a dangerous virus on their phones. The report says that a previously unknown virus has been spotted in the Seoul and Gwanghwamun areas. Citizens should be cautious. There was complete chaos in these areas. Infected people were falling and lying on the floor. Others were running away. Frightened teenagers read this message and could not understand what was happening and what to do. Again, Jeon-woo said it was because of the frog eggs. But this time they didn't listen to him, because they knocked on the glass. When Kang Ji-hoon returned, he could not believe his eyes. He screamed in fright, which scared the others, their faces full of shock. The headman fell down and held on to his classmates who were standing nearby. He was shouting something about her coming. When they returned, they saw Gale standing like a zombie at the entrance to the booth. Everyone screamed. They thought Min Gale was dead. They started calling for her, but she was silent, not raising her head. This picture was driving them crazy. Yeon-woo was the closest to the others. The frightened headman hid like a coward at the feet of his classmates and held someone's hand. He told Jeon-woo to ask if Gale was okay. The boy was indignant why he had to go and not someone else. A frightened So-yeon stood next to him. He looked at her and felt that he had to protect the girl. She was trembling with fear and seemed completely defenseless. There was no choice. Yeon-woo volunteered for Min Gale. He hesitantly asked if she was okay but received no response. Gale stood silently in front of the entrance to the booth. The crowd heard that the zombie girl could hear everything. She just had to ask louder. Gathering his strength, Yeon-woo came a little closer and started asking questions, but he was interrupted and not allowed to finish the job. They received another alert on their phones. There was a lot of tension in the booth, and the sound of the alert scared the teenagers. Jeon-woo took out his phone. The message was again about the virus. This time it had spread even more and had caused damage to almost all of Seoul. No matter how hard he tried to pretend to be brave, he was incredibly afraid to approach Min Gale. So he breathed out a sigh of relief when the notification came, but the joy did not last long. When it seemed that things couldn't get any worse, Gale raised her head and they met Jeon-woo's eyes. Her eyes were white, without pupils. There was mascara and eyeliner smeared around her eyes, giving her a creepy look. Her face was covered with ugly white spots. Gale turned to the noise from the stairs. She could hear a group of people running toward the cable car. They seemed to think that they would be safer near it. But unfortunately, when they got to the top, they were met with fear in the face. 3 young men stood a meter away from the zombies. Seeing them, Gale opened her mouth and hissed at them. It felt like she was out of touch with reality. This was no longer Min Gale. This was a monster. The company screamed in fright. They did not understand what was happening on the cable car. There were only unanswered questions in their minds. Suddenly, something strange happened to Gale. The stuck eggs separated from her body. The girl screamed. It seemed to be very painful. A mass of eggs attacked the company. The sight was simply horrifying. Gale's skin was peeling off as if she was in spring molt. My classmates were shocked by what they saw. They could never have imagined that this would happen. Meanwhile, the white mass sucked on the face of one of the boys, although he tried to defend himself. The virus seemed to suck out the guy's face, and the mass became new skin, firmly growing into the body. A friend from the company approached the victim. He wanted to help, but he was ordered to run away as fast as possible. The guy realized that he wouldn't survive, so he just held this shit up to save the others. He tried to fight to the last, but the more he resisted, the more the virus got a hold of him. Gale's hands also reached the boy and clutched his neck tightly. The teenagers became even more frightened as they watched. Despite this, Kim Joo-bin offered to help the boy, but another classmate was scared to death and didn't like the idea. He was shaking with fear and fell to the floor, covering his ears and closing his eyes. While everyone was panicking and saying goodbye to their lives, Jeon-woo was staring at the door. Surprisingly, he put aside his fear and thought critically, analyzing the situation. The boy realized that it was not Gale. It was a monster, and she was unlikely to wish them well. To protect himself and his friends, Yeon-woo knelt down so that the zombie wouldn't see him and locked the door. Now no one could get in. His classmates were surprised by this heroic act, although some of them may not have understood why he did it. Yeon-woo realized this and began to explain that it was better to close the door so that the monster would not open it when he was done with the company and wanted to find new victims. Suddenly, a guy, scared to death, was banging on the door. His screams frightened Yeonva, who was standing right in front of him on the other side of the door. The guy begged to open the door and let him in. His look was terrifyingly frightening, but the monster was approaching him. The zombie became even bigger. Gale was unrecognizable. The guy started pulling the handle in a panic and praying for Jeon-woo to open the door. It was a matter of life and death. His classmates huddled in a corner, but Yeon-woo remained in the city and thought about what decision to make. He realized that others were obeyed by fear. He was the only one who was thinking critically, so Jeon-woo could not endanger others and did not open the door. At that time, the monster got to the boy and bit him on the elbow. There was no chance of escape. Jeon-woo stood in front, blocking his classmates. It was very loud in the booth. It was as if the class was watching a horror movie, but it was happening in reality. The poor man's blood splashed across the glass, accompanied by a nasty crushing sound. as if someone wanted to make orange juice. The sight was so disgusting that even the boys turned away and screamed. No one wanted to see it. Meanwhile, the victim was almost completely consumed by the monster. It was the guy's last scream before he died. It looked like quicksand. The poor man was being sucked in by the mass and slowly sank to the bottom. The more resistance there was, the stronger he sank into the mass. Jeon-woo's body was covered in cold sweat. The blood ran cold in his veins. They will never forget what happened. It was a nightmare come true. The most terrifying thing was the monster's face. All that was left of Gale was her beautiful black hair and a neat nose. The zombie monster stood up. There were so many masses on the girl's poor body that she was lying on the floor, revealing a view of her bony spine. Jeon-woo looked the monster in the eyes. He could not believe that Gale was no longer with them. Unfortunately, the monster noticed them and screamed, letting them know that they were the next victims. His classmates clung to Jeonwoo as if he were their last hope. He was still blocking the classroom and So-yeon, and she clung to him as well. The monster seemed ready to attack them, when his attention was drawn to the sound of the door opening. Other tourists were climbing the stairs. Shocked, they began to scream, which attracted the attention of the zombies. The second the monster attacked them, it found more victims. There was silence. The stairs were covered with blood mixed with mucus and eggs. The picture resembled an apocalypse. My classmates were sitting in the corner. For a minute it seemed that everything was over and the monster was gone. Like here, a pigeon on the wall started moving, which attracted the attention of teenagers. The whole class was shaking so much that the whole booth was vibrating. Suddenly the pigeons screamed loudly. It had been considered dead for a long time, just like Gale. Would the nightmare repeat itself? This thought flashed through Jeon-woo's mind. It made his face look very scared. One of my classmates shouted why this was happening to them, and the headman covered his mouth so that he would not be heard. The class heard a noise coming from the stairs. Was it the monster coming back? They whispered what they would do if the zombie monster came back, and the panicking classmate was gagged even harder to keep him quiet. The teenagers were trembling and waiting for the monster to come back for them. The sounds began to fade and move away. It looked like Min Gale had left. The danger seemed to be over. I heard someone whimpering from behind the booth. It was Hanmi. The girl cried because she blamed herself and the whole class. She thought that Gale was dead because of them. They could have saved her. The headman, Kang Ji-hoon, immediately yelled at Hanmi. How could she say such a thing? Didn't she see what Gale was doing to the others? He said that if Jeon-woo hadn't closed the door, they would have all died long ago. It seems that they had chosen the wrong headman. Just then, after clearing his throat, Kim Joo-bin noticed something. His attention suddenly shifted to the ceiling of the booth. He grabbed the hatch on top with his hands and tried to open it. Fortunately, the guy's height allowed him to reach the ceiling. The class watched in bewilderment until Joo-bin fully opened the emergency exit. The guy started to climb out. The headman yelled at him and told him to stop. Joo-bin didn't understand why he shouldn't get out of the booth. After all, there was no telling what would happen if Gale returned. While she was gone, he had to get out of danger. But the starosta insisted on his point, and said that they would not be able to escape from her. Yeon-woo's attention turned to So-yeon. The girl was shaking, hugging her knees, and her eyes were staring into space. It was clear that she was very scared. Despite this, So-yeon noticed that Yeon-woo was staring at her and put him down. She put the guy to shame. She looked at him and asked if he wanted to tell her something if he was looking at her like that. Of course, this question shocked the guy. Uncertain of her name, he said that he just wanted to know if she was okay. The girl was in a stupor. I could see it in her eyes, which indicated a lack of understanding. Nevertheless, she said that she was fine and asked Jeon-woo to stop staring at her like that. The guy was ready to fall through the ground. He felt so ashamed. After apologizing, he turned away. So-yeon didn't see it because she had her head buried in her knees to avoid seeing anyone. By the look on his face, one could tell that it was more frightening for Yeon-woo than the Min Gale monster. Yeon-woo came back to reality. He heard the headman continue to persuade Kim Joo-bin not to leave the booth. He said it was too dangerous outside. They should all stay inside the booth. Kang Ji-hoon continued that in order for them all to get out of danger, they just need to wait for the rescuers in the booth. A girl behind him named Hannah looked at her hands. They were trembling. The classmate could tell that something was bothering her. She told the starosta to stop telling everyone what to do, that he had no right to speak at all. Kang Ji-hoon did not expect to hear this. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. It seemed he was no longer cool in the eyes of his classmates. Kana continued. She accused the starosta of cowardice. How much longer could he run and hide? He did not help Gale and instead just ran away. She added that everything that happened was because of him. Ji-hoon was shocked by these words. The headman could not stand it. He stood up and wanted to attack Kana. She had no right to accuse him like that. It was good that Kim Joo-bin held him back. But this did not stop Hannah. She continued to accuse Ji-hoon of preventing her from helping Gale. The headman was not spared. The girl turned on Yeon-woo. She accused him of closing the door when he felt afraid, even though the class had not asked him to do so. She looked and sounded crazy, blaming everyone for the situation. Her eyes were crazy. Kang Ji-hoon was seriously angry. He was outraged by Hannah's accusations, even though she had done nothing to defend them and had remained silent the entire time. Jubin had a hard time holding the headman. Ji-hoon shouted loudly at Hannah to stop blaming him for everything, because they had been through it together. Hanmi stood up for her friend. She ordered everyone to stop, but the starosta did not stop. He said that if Hannah was so good, she should leave now. She did nothing but talk. Suddenly Ji-hoon fell silent. Everyone stopped talking and stared at Hannah. So-yeon asked if the girl was okay, and then a soft whimper was heard. The starosta was outraged because she started the quarrel, and now she's using her girlish ways to make the guy the offender. Suddenly, everyone screamed. They were frightened by the sound coming from the booth. It turned out that it was just a radio. The voice of a rescuer was coming from it, asking if there was anyone in the booth. The connection was poor, and the radio was broadcasting individual words that barely formed a logical sentence. The still frightened teenagers did not immediately realize what was going on. They stayed away from this monstrous machine. The radio again said that the control room was talking to them, and the connection was cut off. Although the class didn't say a word, their screams gave a sign that there were people in the booth. The cable car began to descend back down. The teenagers exhaled a happy sigh. On the way back, Hanmi was chatting in the class group chat. She asked if everyone was safe, but no one answered her. The girl said out loud that no one was answering. She did not know what to do. Yeon-woo looked at So-young again. They were not standing too close. The guy noticed that she started crying too, with her hands over her eyes. So-yeon muttered Min-gail's name under her breath and said how sorry she was for her friend. She didn't deserve this. Hanmi noticed her friend's condition and threw her arms around her. So-young asked if the others were okay. Yeon-woo was watching the scene. Hanmi assured him that everything would be fine, and Yeon-woo looked down and wished he had been the one to hug So-young. The starosta, watching this picture, asked if they really had time to worry about others, thus putting himself in danger of starting another quarrel. Kang Ji-hoon continued. He said they didn't even know what was happening downstairs. When they came down, Ji-hoon would go straight home, but his monologue was interrupted by the sound of the cable car. Everyone looked up. Something bad must have happened. The cable car stopped. The cabin was rocking from side to side from the rather abrupt stop. The teenagers were shocked. They did not understand why the cable car stopped, why it did not continue to descend. Kim Jubin and Yeon-woo grabbed a radio. They shouted into the receiver that the cable car had stopped halfway, but no one answered. Suddenly I heard a noise from above again. The sound was like a squeak, very sharp and piercing. A miracle happened, because the cable car started moving again and seemed to continue descending. The class's life was shortened by such adventures by 10 years. Finally, they saw the building. This meant they were almost at the city. Suddenly, my classmates changed their faces again. As they approached, they could see that the entire building literally consisted of white mass. There was so much of it that it was leaking out of the doors and windows. The teenagers no longer knew or wanted to leave the booth. After all, downstairs, right at the exit of the cable car, monsters were waiting for them, chained to the floor and walls. All the corridors and passages were covered with monster bodies. The fear of approaching was exacerbated by the fact that the white mass on the building began to move. The teenagers had nowhere to run. It was a good thing the booth was closed. One of the lying monsters started to get up. Perhaps the frog eggs were acting as eyes, because it is not clear how the blind monster noticed the cable car in the distance. Yeon-woo was the first to notice the monster. Fear seized his body again and shivers ran down his spine. The monster raised its face and screamed as if greeting new victims. There were no eyes on it, only a huge mouth. Yeon-woo was thinking of a plan in his head to save themselves. Suddenly, he and the rest of the class were shaken in different directions. The booth and the cable car were rocking from side to side. No one understood what was happening. All the teenagers were thrown to the floor screaming. It felt like they were falling and about to break. And then there was an accident, like something snapped. The booth collided with the wall and broke. Now the teenagers were not safe in it. My classmates were lying unconscious on the floor. Unfortunately, no one could withstand the shock. Jeon-woo was the first to recover. His head was buzzing and cracking. He might have suffered a concussion. He was moaning in pain. The other classmates also recovered, and everyone began to cautiously get up. There seemed to be no injuries, and the entire class survived. Kang Ji-hoon said he felt like he was in hell, adventure after adventure, and his neck was in unbearable pain. So-yeon asked what had just happened. Did they get stuck on the cable car? The girl bruised her arm. When she hit, she was thrown against the wall, and the others fell on top of her. She looked up and was shocked. So-young's eyes grew wide and she looked very surprised. Behind the door, the girl saw a white mass. It seemed to be a zombie monster that wanted to get inside. Unfortunately, the glass broke on impact, and the teenagers were in real danger. They had to think of something quickly to save themselves. So-yeon shouted to the others that the monster was approaching and clearly did not want to be friends with them. The teenagers turned and screamed in fright, not having had time to fully recover from the accident. And then the zombie monster's hand slammed against the glass. It was like a horror movie. Yeon-woo and Kang Ji-hoon screamed at the top of their lungs. The monster screamed back, and now it wasn't just his arm that was hitting the glass. The whole body of the zombie was trying to get inside. The second arm of the zombie monster found a hole in the glass. The teenagers' chances of survival were becoming even less with each passing second. The hole was breaking, and the monster's body was penetrating more and more. A white mass fell from the zombie monster to the floor. It looked like a highly heated marshmallow on a fire falling from a stick. The teenagers reacted immediately and ran to the other end of the booth as fast as they could. At the same time, the monster's body was making its way more and more inside the booth, making a very disgusting sound of mucus. As soon as the zombie monster's head got inside, it fell to the floor. It seems that the frog egg virus was eating away at the bones, so the monster's body couldn't hold itself up. The headman, Kang Ji-hoon, broke the glass of the booth with his foot in fear. It seems he wanted to escape from the other side of the cable car, but at that time, something happened that scared Yeon-woo even more. He turned toward the sound and screamed very loudly. The monster's entire body was inside the booth, but as before, its body could not hold itself up and just lay flattened on the floor, making strange zombie noises like in horror movies. The teenagers screamed. Yeon-woo was in the front again, shielding them all. Kang Ji-hoon continued to break the glass. The monster started to get up and screamed. It was clear that instead of eyes, it had holes. Its spine was clearly visible from under the white mass that was now its skin. Ji-hoon shouted at the zombie monster to get out of his way and just take off. The headman was very angry and scared. All his aggression was converted into strength, and with one kick he broke all the glass from the booth, making a passage for escape. The teenagers just fell out in a heap on the ground. Everyone was afraid, and most of all wanted to get out and stay alive. No one wanted to be the last to leave the booth. When one of his classmates turned around, he saw something that scared him. He shouted for everyone to run away immediately. What the boy saw was a monster approaching their exit. Its white tentacles were already visible to the teenagers. Without thinking, the class ran as fast as they could. They only had time to turn back and see if the zombie monster was chasing them. Yeon-woo screamed as he saw the zombie get out of the booth and approach them. They were lucky that the zombie was quite slow in movement, so the teenagers ran even faster. Unfortunately, So-yeon tripped on the stairs. She was the last to run. It was good that Jeon-woo noticed this and stopped. He could not leave his beloved helpless in danger. He reached out to So-yeon to grab the girl's hand and help her up. It looked like she had hurt her leg. The girl did not expect such a heroic act from the boy. She was even a little scared at first. Yeon-woo noticed that the zombie monster was about to catch up with them, so he quickly tugged on the girl's sleeve to keep running. He shouted for the girl to get up quickly, otherwise they would be caught up and then die. The monster was about to catch up with them, but So-yeon stood up and together, hand in hand, they continued to run. Meanwhile, the rest of the class had already entered the building and were heading down the stairs to the exit. If they could get out of this lair, their chances of survival would be much higher. At a bend, the headman, Kang Ji-hoon, stopped because he saw something that scared him. It was a corridor completely covered with slime mixed with blood. Other zombie monsters seemed to rise from the slime. Others ran up from behind, but the starosta stopped them. They could not go there to face certain death. They needed a plan, but the monsters had already heard them. Some of them began to rise and scream, making themselves heard. A classmate saw this and screamed. Adrenaline mixed with fear, and this violent mixture spread through the body, through the blood. At the same time, So-young and Yeon-woo were still running down the stairs from the zombie monster by the hand. The girl was very scared and did not want to let go of the boy. Suddenly, she stopped and swallowed loudly. The girl asked Yeon-woo to wait a moment. The boy turned and looked at her in puzzlement. He did not understand what could be so important when it was literally a matter of life and death. But when he looked down, he was very surprised. Yeon-woo saw that So-yeon's leg was reddening at the knee. She was moaning in pain and could not continue to run at this pace. He asked if she was okay. When he looked closer, he saw that her knee was not only bruised but bleeding. It looked like So-yeon had hurt herself badly when she fell on the stairs. Jeon-woo began to apologize to the girl, thinking it was all his fault. The girl tried to calm him down, because in her opinion, it happened when they were running away from the cable car. She said that Jeon-woo shouldn't have worried. She added that she was very grateful for the guy's help. It was really valuable to her. Of course, the guy blushed at these words, because at the time he was just doing what he thought he had to do, not thinking about what a hero he was in the eyes of the love of his life, So-yeon. Suddenly, their conversation and rather sweet moment was interrupted by the sound of someone climbing the stairs and a loud scream. It was their classmate. He was running like crazy and shouting to his friends to run away too. Behind him, the head man Kang Ji-hoon was running. He yelled at the guy in front to shut up or he would kill him on the spot. Yeon-woo asked why they were coming back. Ji-hoon explained that they couldn't get down to the first floor. It was hell. Kim Joo-bin added that there are also monsters there, and there are a lot of them. The class did not stop and kept running. Their plan had failed, and it looked like they would never get out of the building. They went up to the floor where Jeonhwa was burned with soju. The room looked as if it had just been cleaned. For a second, it seemed that the nightmare was a dream. The teenagers stood cautiously at the entrance to the room. From previous experience, they were afraid to go in right away, so they first carefully examined everything. Everything looked very safe, which was actually alarming because on the other floors everything was covered with a white mass of zombie monsters. Was this really a chance for salvation? Meanwhile, the monster that had been chasing them out of the booth was crawling down the stairs. It smelled blood and followed the trail. Like that shark, his appetite became animalistic at the smell of blood. Soon, he would reach the teenagers. In the meantime, the class decided to take a breather in a safe room and think about their next plan of action to save them. Hannah managed to get through to her mom. She cried into the phone and said she didn't know what to do. She couldn't reach her teacher either. Kim Joo-bin was texting the news on his phone and saying that it was all about monsters on the internet. The head man, Kang Ji-hoon, told him to call 119 because he couldn't get through. Joo-bin's face changed dramatically, as if some new idea had come to his mind, or he heard something strange. Joo-bin went to the windows. The head man, Kang Ji-hoon, asked where he was going, but the boy abruptly told him to close the window because chaos had started. Outside the window was a parking lot. The cars were covered with a white mass. Apparently the drivers inside were also turned into zombie monsters. As Kim Joo-bin got closer, he saw that some of the drivers were trying to get out of the car, but the white eggs were stuck to them. If they were infected, it meant the end and the drivers would turn into monsters. Meanwhile, Yeon-woo also called his worried mother. He said that he was trapped in the cable car building on the second floor and could not get out. His mother said that she and her father had just left and asked him to be careful, to sit quietly and not to go anywhere. But the boy's attention was drawn to So-yeon's cry of pain. Her friends gathered around her. Hanmi had a small first aid kit with her and tried to provide So-yeon with first aid as much as possible in the apocalypse. Jeon-woo watched what was happening from under his cap. He didn't want the girl to notice that he was watching, but he was nevertheless very worried about So-yeon. The girl's wound was burning and bleeding badly, but she was holding on. She was pleased that her friends were taking care of her. Suddenly, Yeon-woo's lovemaking was interrupted by another classmate, who pushed the boy and asked if he had any change or coins. Joo-ben wanted to use the vending machine, but he didn't have any change on him. The guy asked Jeon-woo if he wanted anything, but he was refused. Joo-ben was shaking violently. It was as if he had a fever. Yeon-woo noticed his friend's condition and asked if he was okay. He got a hysterical response. The guy felt bad. Not everyone could stay calm in such a dangerous situation. Kim Joo-bin began to curse the day he came on this school field trip. Now he would have stayed at home and watched the live broadcast, and he wished he hadn't agreed to the adventure with the class. The guy continued to monologue about how bad he felt. However, Yeon-woo's thoughts were interrupted by the fact that he really thought he was going to die. But instead, the young man was able to save his beloved So-yeon. The thought of saving the girl warmed his soul at this difficult moment, especially the fact that So-yeon thanked him for what he had done. Suddenly, the boy's attention shifted to the floor again. It seems that he had noticed something strange and dangerous again. Looking closer, Jeon-woo noticed traces of blood on the floor. It was So-yeon's blood, and the drops led directly to the second floor where the teenagers were hiding. Jeon-woo followed these traces and concluded that the girl was grieving. Walking further, he realized that So-yeon had been bleeding all the way to the shelter, leaving traces behind her. When he went out into the corridor, he saw a white mass of mucus blocking his way. Looking up, the boy turned pale. He saw something terrible in front of him. What the young man saw was a huge white zombie monster standing a few meters away and breathing right into his face. The guy froze in fear, although he had to act immediately and run away. Time was running out. The situation was critically dangerous. At the same second, the monster abruptly attacked the boy with its ugly white body. Meanwhile, on the second floor, the teenagers screamed in fear. They must have seen what happened to Jeon-woo. Fortunately, the boy managed to dodge the monster. The boy reacted quickly enough. But the zombie monster entered the room where the teenagers were hiding and fell to the floor. Turning his head, Jeon-woo screamed in fear. He probably thought he was going to die. But the monster's ugly appearance up close was no less frightening. Without hesitation, the teenagers began to run away, screaming as fast as they could. The monster got up and ran after them too. The zombie was slowly and very difficult to get to its feet. Its white, sticky mass stuck to the floor, which constrained its movements. This gave the teenagers a bit of a head start, so they had time to escape and find a new shelter. The zombie monster growled, making itself known. It seemed to say that no matter how well they ran and hid from him, he would still find them. The monster put its tentacles into the guy who was running last. It seemed to be Yeon-woo. His ugly, angry white paws were about to reach the boy's leg. If he grabbed his leg, he would be in trouble. Meanwhile, Kang Ji-hoon, the headman, and his friend Kang Min almost ran out of the second floor and looked for a way out. The guys were shouting victoriously because they were about to reach the exit and then they would be safe. So-yeon was the last one to run. However, she noticed something that made her pause. She noticed a zombie monster approaching her. He could smell the girl's blood and therefore, she was a tasty morsel for him. Meanwhile, Yeon-woo managed to catch up and even overtake the company. He and Kim Joo-bin were almost at the exit door. Behind them were the boys Kang Ji-hoon and Kang Min. They shouted after them to keep the door open. When they got to the exit, the boys attacked Yeonwa and his friend with their fists, even though they did not have time to close the door. However, Kim Joo-bin did not stop and ran up the stairs. He seemed to be very scared. When he reached the end, he stopped to catch his breath and rest. Just then, he heard someone cursing at him loudly from behind him. He turned around to see who it was and got scared. Before he could turn around, the class head, Kang Ji-hoon, jumped on him and began to swear and strangle him. Kim Joo-bin began to make excuses and begged the headman to listen to him, but he did not stop strangling him. Ji-hoon was very angry, just furious. Kang Ji-hoon's face turned red. His eyes were bloodshot with anger. He was ready to kill the coward who wanted to leave his classmates to die. Yeon-woo and Kang Min tried to break up the fight. Otherwise, Ji-hoon would have really just killed the boy. The headman had problems controlling his emotions. Kang Min called out to the boys because he saw something. This stopped the fight for a while and they forgot that they wanted to kill each other. On the floor, they saw the cable car they had come down from earlier. They did not expect to see it because it was on a completely different floor. Kang Ming explained that each floor is connected to an entrance and exit for safe exit in case of emergency. So the teenagers just went around the circle. Meanwhile, out of breath, Hannah came running down the stairs. The boys had forgotten that the girls were with them. They were so engrossed in their fight. The girls scared the starosta with her screams. One could feel that she was about to cry. It was obvious that something terrible had happened. Kang Min asked if she was okay, sensing her condition. But Hannah couldn't say a word, just shook her head. They asked where the other girls were. But Hannah didn't seem to know the answer. The teenagers turned to the stairs to wait for the other girls to arrive. Meanwhile, on the second floor where the classroom was located, there was a deathly silence. So-yeon stood breathlessly against the wall and breathed nervously but very quietly, trying to calm down somehow. A monster was standing behind her. He did not see her because she hid behind a wall. She realized that she could die now. At this time, Hanmi was calling out to her friend So-young. She was looking for her all over the floor. Turning her head, she finally found her friend. Hanmi asked if So-young was okay because she had an injured leg. The girls were whispering so that the zombie monster wouldn't hear them. They had to figure out how to escape. The others had already escaped, so they had only themselves to rely on. The girls were a few steps away from the door. If they ran quickly, they had a chance of survival because the monster would find them sooner or later. But So-yeon didn't think so. She wanted to stay there. The girl's wound was bringing down her morale. She was afraid she would not make it. Hanmi agreed with her. They thought the monster couldn't see them, so they just had to hide until it left. So-yeon put her hand over her mouth. She wanted to cry, but she couldn't. The girl's leg kept bleeding and hurt a lot. Meanwhile, the zombie monster just stood there and sniffed out its victims. Meanwhile, the boys were already going down to the second floor to see where the girls were and what had happened to them for not running after them. At first, they saw nothing, so they wondered where So-young and Hanmi had run to. The headman, Kang Ji-hoon, asked the others where they were because he could not see them. After all, he was the headman, and was worried about his classmates. Jeon-woo was the first to notice the girls. He told the others about it. What he saw shocked him. They could only see So-young hiding behind the wall. But Hanmi must have been with her, even though she was not visible. The girl was still covering her mouth with her hands so that the zombie monster wouldn't hear them. Jeon-woo noticed this and realized what was going on. His face changed dramatically because he saw something that scared him. Yeon-woo saw a monster standing right behind the girls. It seemed to have smelled So-young's blood, which he had been chasing for so long. The girl put her hands over her mouth even more tightly. Her eyes widened as if she had seen something very terrible, and so it was. So-yeon saw the monster's reflection in the window in front of her. She hoped that the zombie was not so smart and would not look out the window, but her hopes were in vain. The girl only had time to look away when she realized what was going to happen. The monster screamed from the corner of the wall. It sounded like a victory cry, as if the zombie monster was proud to have finally found its victim. The girl was numb. So-yeon could not move a finger out of fear, although she had to act immediately because it was a matter of life and death. The monster roared again and wanted to attack and bite the girl. Just then, Yeon-woo ran into the room and screamed at the zombie monster, distracting its attention from the girls So-young and Hanmi. The monster stopped and analyzed what was happening. Yeon-woo ran screaming to the second floor, making more noise so that the zombie monster could hear and switch to the boy. And the young man succeeded, because the monster immediately noticed Yeonwa. The zombie's attention was quite distracted, as it easily switched from one victim to another. So the girls didn't bother him anymore. The monster ran after the boy. Now Yeon-woo had to figure out where to run to keep himself and his classmates safe. The guy ran as fast as he could, not even having time to turn back. It seems that Yeon-woo was already regretting his actions, but there was no turning back. He had to run away from the zombie monster. So-yeon watched what was happening. She saw her rescuer Yeon-woo appear on the floor, followed by a zombie monster. The girl could not believe what was happening. She was about to say goodbye to her life when Yeon-woo appeared out of nowhere and saved her and Hanmi. At this time, the guy was running up the stairs, very professionally avoiding the white slime on the floor. Yeon-woo decided to turn back. He was very frightened by what he saw, which gave him the strength to run even faster, because dying was not in his plans. The monster was exactly half a floor behind him, but he was steadily catching up. It was not that slow. It was as if the boy's fear fueled it. He managed to turn back. The zombie monster was not as agile, which gave the guy a bit of a head start. When he got upstairs, he finally saw an open door. It was the exit. The boy made a circle and ran to the cable car, but from the other side. He had to quickly figure out how to escape and where to hide from the zombie monster. Yeon-woo decides to close the door behind him. He thought it would stop the monster for a while. The guy looks at the closed door and waits to see what will happen. Yeon-woo had a little time to recover. He thought that the zombie monster had stopped chasing him. The guy began to quietly descend the stairs at a calm pace, as if he hadn't just been chased by a huge white monster. Going down, the guy was thinking about everything that had happened. He could not believe that he had done such a crazy, reckless thing. When he got to the floor where the girls were hiding, he called out to his classmates and broke into a run. But to his surprise, the room was completely empty and no one responded to the boy. It scared Yeonwoo. The guy stood there in silence in a stupor, not knowing what to expect and where to go next. He saw a broken pot with some kind of plant, and a broken window next to it. When he came closer and looked through the window, he saw something. Outside the window, his classmates were running across the roof of the building. They got out but did not wait for him, not even So-yeon, whom he had saved from certain death. He watched the teenagers run away with sadness in his eyes. Did they think that Yeonwoo had been eaten by a monster and had to run away from it too? My classmates took turns descending from the roof of the building's entrance. It was quite high. So-yeon was the last to go down. Probably because of her leg injury, she could not run fast, so she was at the end. She noticed Yeon-woo in the window. The headman, Kang Ji-hoon, gave the girl his hand and shouted at her to not be distracted and to come down quickly. It is not clear why they are running away. Then, as if out of nowhere, a zombie monster appeared behind her. It turned out that his classmates were running away from him. How could he catch up with them so quickly? Yeon-woo watched in silence. He would not have time to catch up with his friends. Is this the end and now it's every man for himself? Finally, he called out to his classmates once more. It seems that Yeon-woo did not see that they were running away from the monster, or thought it was another zombie. But the guy did not give up. He ran to the exit. We had to get out of the building. He ran to the hole in the glass that his classmates had made and stopped abruptly. The boy saw a huge zombie monster that was probably chasing his classmates. It seems that Yeon-woo will not get out of this trap so easily. He had to come up with a plan of action as soon as possible. He looked at the picture outside with horror and did not understand what to do now. His classmates had left him here alone in this damned trap. There was only one question in his mind that remained unanswered. Why did they leave him? With or without them, Yeon-woo had to get out somehow and save his life. He began to crawl out of the hole in the glass that his classmates had made. But something stopped him. It was something he saw outside. There was no one there. His classmates were gone. Yeon-woo's face changed dramatically from what he saw outside the window. He cried out in sadness. The guy quickly took out his phone and started typing a message to someone. Yeon-woo wrote in the class group chat that he was staying in the building, hoping they would come back for him. He found Kang-min in his contacts. He was often holding his phone and checking the news, so he must have heard Yeon-woo's call. But then the phone rang sharply. He thought it was Kang-min. Yeon-woo started talking into the phone, calling for help, but no one answered. Suddenly the phone rang again, which scared the guy. He picked up the phone to check what it was. It turned out that it was another danger warning. It said that Seoul Station and several other places where the teenagers were found were declared emergency zones with a special danger. Suddenly, another notification sound came from the toilet. The already frightened boy screamed in fear. He went to the restroom. He opened the door. There were no monsters, and he could breathe a sigh of relief. When he opened the door, he could not believe his eyes. From one of the booths, a rather familiar voice could be heard complaining and hardly crying. It turned out that it was his friend Kim Joo-bin. He was unable to jump out of the window and was left alone in the building. It seems that the guy was scolding himself for his weakness, because now he will most likely die in a building filled with zombie monks. Yeon-woo knocked on the booth and called Joo-bin, which scared his friend who was already preparing to die. But Kim Joo-bin did not answer. So Yeon-woo knocked again and called his friend. Now there were two of them, so it would be easier to get out. In the end, Joo-bin responded to Yeon-woo's words because he finally recognized the boy's voice. The friend opened the door of the stall that served as his hiding place and asked Yeon-woo what he was doing here. Joo-bin could not believe his eyes. He looked at his friend and noticed that he was crying. The guy started mocking Yeon-woo, saying he was a loser and crying. After all, real men never cry. In response, Yeon-woo started yelling at his friend that he was actually dumped too, and who else was a loser. Joo-bin retaliated and yelled back at Yeon-woo that his friend was a snotty little brat and that he had dumped his classmates because they were in his way. But instead, Yeon-woo threw his arms around his friend and said he was glad to see him anyway. Joo-bin was not prepared for such a display of love, but there was not much time for calf tenderness. They had to get out of the building. Yeon-woo went to the door to see if it was clear. He called out to his friend Kim Joo-bin to come out of the booth and they got out together. Watch how the two friends got out of the building full of zombies in this episode. Joo-bin did not like this idea. He said it was better to just close the door and stay inside. Yeon-woo suggested another method, just running away. Joo-bin insisted that his friend go and lock the door, because hell could happen again. Yeon-woo obeyed and went to the exit to check that everything was clear. The guy stopped. Something caught his attention. He looked again at the window and the broken pot. The place where his classmates had run away. A frightened Joo-bin ran up to Yeon-woo. He nervously asked what had happened and how his classmates had escaped. It was strange that Joo-bin did not know how the teenagers had escaped. Yeon-woo said he knew how they escaped. He showed me where his classmates ran. Those moments of the classroom escape ran through his mind again. It was very painful for him. He remembered So-yeon's last look, though it was surprisingly quite frightened. She saw him in the window, but did not stop and continued to run away, although he saved her life twice. Meanwhile, Kim Joo-bin continued to complain about his classmates. He said they had abandoned them, as if they were nothing, and that they could no longer call them friends. They could not even go out through them. The monsters outside began to gather and group together, but Yeon-woo interrupted his friend's monologue. He asked why Joo-bin didn't go with them. Couldn't he duck and now pretend that his classmates left him alone? Kim Joo-bin began to make excuses that it was not like that and that he was right. It was Yeon-woo who was the snotty one, not him. The boys sat silently alone in a corner of the second floor. Joo-bin interrupted the deathly silence. He asked how long they had to stay in the building in this state. The guy asked if Yeon-woo was hungry. It is not clear how long they have been waiting here. Yeon-woo said they spent about an hour alone, abandoned on the second floor, looking down sadly. It turned out that the guy was looking at his phone. It was making a call to 119, but there was no connection. Joo-bin was surprised that his friend was still calling security. It was obviously not the first call in an hour. However, Yeon-woo reassured his friend that his parents were almost there to help them. But this did not calm Jae-bin down a bit. After all, nothing would change if Yeon-woo's parents came. There is no way out of the building. Yeon-woo stuck to his opinion, because there had to be some other way, and continued to search for something on his phone. He received a message from his mother on his phone, asking him to watch the news. The situation is really scary, and it is better for the boys not to go out and stay in the building. The mom also sent a link to a news video. Yeon-woo opened it and started watching the video. It said that in some areas of Seoul, where cells of an unknown virus appeared, the government declared an extremely dangerous disaster zone situation. The guys were in the epicenter of the events.